It was a bombshell announcement that sent shockwaves around the world. During an international conference, French President Emmanuel Macron stated that deploying Western troops into Ukraine was not out of the question. The announcement was met with immediate condemnation by both NATO states and Russia itself, with Kremlin spokesman Dmitry stating that sending any Western troops into Ukraine would not be in the best interests of any involved party. Yet Macron has seen the writing on the wall. The situation in Ukraine is precarious, and should Ukraine fall, NATO might not have a choice when it comes to war against Russia. To be fair, Macron was largely speaking of sending non-combatant troops, similar to the known presence of British troops inside Ukraine, assisting with the logistics of various weapon systems sent there. However, he was purposefully ambiguous about sending combat troops, or at least attempting to be for strategic gain by injecting doubt into Moscow's war plans about the possibility of having to face the military might of NATO in Ukraine. Yet the immediate response from multiple NATO members stating that this would absolutely not happen effectively killed that plan. Macron was not entirely incorrect when he stated years ago that NATO was brain dead. The fact of the matter is that there is far more at stake than Ukraine, and NATO has been criminally irresponsible in the last 2 years, happily enjoying the peace of its own lands while sending largely symbolic amounts of equipment to stem Russian aggression. It's clear that Russia has greater plans than just Ukraine, as evidenced by September 2021 security guarantee presented to the United States, where Ukraine is only mentioned twice, and Russia called for a halt to any further NATO membership and demilitarization of Central Europe by NATO. The document has some reasonable points, such as each nation no longer staging nuclear weapons outside of their own borders. That's a compromise that heavily favors Russia, but a reasonable request for the sake of the world not turning into a massive fallout LARP. Yet, the demand that NATO effectively demilitarize Central Europe only favors Russia and had a very specific intent to intimidate the Baltics and Poland. The Baltic states remain NATO's most vulnerable members, with a population of around 6 million between all three of them, and being difficult to reinforce in case of Russian invasion thanks to the choke point caused by the Suwalki Gap. The gap is the only strip of land that connects the Baltics to Poland and thus the rest of NATO, and through which NATO forces would have to drive to counterattack the Russian offensive. Yet the gap is surrounded on both sides by Belarus, a Russian proxy state, and Kaliningrad, a heavily militarized Russian enclave. If NATO forces attempt to drive north through the gap, they would be hammered on both sides by air and missile attacks, and the lack of infrastructure makes it impossible to move large amounts of troops quickly, especially if there is a steady stream of refugees trying to flee the fighting. Pushing major NATO combat power as far west as Germany means that the Baltics and Poland would feel ever more exposed. Poland likewise is in a poor defensive position, given that it occupies a large swath of the flat European plain. This is terrain that favors Russia's massive armored forces, which may technologically be inferior, but as the fighting in Ukraine has proven, quantity has a significant quality all its own. Then there's Moldova, which sits on Ukraine's western flank. The breakaway province of Transnistria is pro-Russian and currently hosts between 1,000 to 2,000 Russian troops. It's known that at the start of the Ukraine invasion, Russia hoped to launch a seaborne assault on Odessa along the Ukrainian southern coast, but the operation was halted due to weather and a series of setbacks. Had such an assault succeeded, though, Russia would have been able to push west and link up with Transnistria. An assault on Moldova would have been inevitable, all under the guise of liberating Russian speakers. If Russia wins in Ukraine, such an assault is equally inevitable, bringing Russian forces ever closer to the very vulnerable heart of Europe. For too long has the West been blissfully and ignorantly happy to ignore the Russian threat, drunk off the peace dividend they reaped when the West won history at the end of the Cold War. But Russia never forgot the humiliation, and Russia's expansion into Europe has always been a matter of national survival. The nation sits at the far end of the European plain, and its naval ports are all easily choked off. Restoring the old Soviet bloc adds a buffer against any possible European invasion, as the nation has suffered repeatedly throughout its history, and widens Russia's ability to project naval power past its own shores. But for all the naysayers who want to believe that even if Russia wins in Ukraine, that would be the end of it, Expansion is also almost certainly an existential matter. The Russian state is in an inevitable decline. The nation is poorly diversified economically, with over half of its GDP coming from the sale of fossil fuels. Increasingly, it's not even able to sell more lucrative refined products due to technological bans from the West. Instead, it has to export low-profit crude oil that other nations like India and China then refine and resell for a substantial profit. Combined with the price cap imposed by the European Union and its two major customers, China and India exploiting its weakened position to negotiate heavy discounts, the Russian economy is inevitably going to shrink. At the moment, it's being propped up by the estimated $312 billion in reserves the nation had available at the start of the Ukraine war, with $300 billion of the total $612 billion frozen in Western banks. Those reserves will run out. With some like Jeffrey Sonnenfeld from Yale estimating Russia may have another 1.5 to 2 years left. But it doesn't matter anyway because the world is transitioning away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, an inevitable process that just isn't necessary to stabilize our climate, but one that is a top national defense priority for many nations. The massive leverage Russia was able to exert on Europe at the start of the Ukraine war, due to the reliance on Russian oil, was a warning sign to the world. If you don't want to be held hostage by foreign powers, who either provide your energy or can interdict your energy shipments, you need to produce it domestically and renewably. This means that over the next half-century, Russia stands to lose as much as over half of its GDP. The nation's inability to innovate technologically, thanks to poor investments and an ongoing brain drain from the exodus of young professionals, also means Russia is not competitive in the information space, the hallmark of a robust and modern economy. Russia's Yandex, which was Google's largest competition in the region, was recently acquired by state-backed groups at a significantly discounted price, evidence that the entire endeavor is unraveling. Originally, Putin had wanted to nationalize Yandex so as to exert greater control over the information space, but was warned that its technical specialists would all quit in protest. Then there's the Russian Far East, a region rich in energy resources that China has been hungrily eyeing for 2 decades now. The ethnic Russian population there is rapidly shrinking as Russians move west closer to Moscow, and they're being replaced by an influx of Chinese immigrants. Chinese investments in the region now significantly outweigh Russian investments, and Chinese culture has begun to displace Russian culture, with a Chinese official maps agency last year revealing new maps naming Chinese territory seized by the Russian Empire in the 17th through 19th century in their native Chinese names. The intention is clear: China wants a big bite out of Russia, and Russia might not be able to prevent it. Russia is doomed to become a second-rate economy and global power. But much like empires throughout history, territorial expansion could delay or outright avert such a disaster, seizing Ukraine, the Baltics, even Poland. All nations with diversified and technologically leaning economies could inject the new Russian Empire with the economic lifeblood that it needs to remain competitive and stave off inevitable collapse. Russia has every incentive to win in Ukraine and keep going, even if Europe is still too irresponsibly asleep at the wheel to acknowledge it. Is this realistic, though? Does Putin honestly think he can continue his campaign? One need only look at the current state of affairs both at home and abroad in Russia. The nation has begun to mobilize its industry for war-rate production. In October of 2023, Putin created a new military council that would oversee domestic industry and had the legal power to direct specific industries and even gain control over their budgets in order to take a direct managerial role. While defense industry workers were already moved to round-the-clock shifts back in summer, new legislation also allowed for employees to have vacations canceled or overtime enforced on them. The State Duma also announced legislation allowing the government to seize the assets of any company ending its Russian operations. While this would have significant effect on discouraging investment into Russia, both now and the future, should sanctions be dropped, the fact that Russia is willing to cut itself off from international financing is a very troubling sign that Russia has charted a course for its own future, one that does not include Western businesses reintroducing themselves into Russia. And this prepares the nation for a larger-scale war against NATO. To make matters worse, Russia has taken the measure of NATO and found it severely lacking. Despite NATO economies and military power dwarfing Russia, the alliance has for 2 years completely failed to stop Russian aggression inside of Ukraine. The entire alliance has failed to meet Putin's aggression head-on, with NATO leaders pussyfooting around Putin's naked hostilities and self-deterring from providing the military aid Ukraine desperately needs. Only nations like Poland, directly on the firing line of a future war with Russia, have taken the situation seriously enough to send significant amounts of aid. What aid has been provided has been piecemeal, always negotiated down from what was originally proposed out of fear of provoking Russia, and delivered in unpredictable spurts that leave Ukraine unable to coordinate its military campaign. If Ukraine doesn't know when the next aid shipment will come, and what will come with it, it simply can't afford to wage decisive campaigns and risk losing equipment that might not be replaced. NATO's flaccid response to Russian aggression has proven to Putin that he can indeed intimidate the militarily superior alliance. But it's also exposed a significant weakness that 30 years of dominating low-intensity conflict in Africa and the Middle East has hidden. NATO's defense industry is abysmal. The alliance routinely produces true world-beating weapons. Russian engineers are eager for access to the Storm Shadow, the F-35, or German diesel-electric submarines. But Western defense industries are basically artisanal compared to the Russian megalith. Russia might pump out equipment that would have been impressive back in the 1980s compared to NATO's reverse-engineered UFO technology. But that doesn't matter when NATO stocks run out within weeks of fighting, or when they can't send tanks to Ukraine and establish longer-term resupply of tanks because their industries can't produce replacements fast enough. Russian industry is believed to be creating about 400 new tanks a year, with many more being refurbished from dwindling but still significant reserves. The US, meanwhile, produces just 120 Abrams a year, and the vaunted Leopard is truly an endangered species, with an estimated 50 tanks or so produced a year and 60 to 70 modernized a year. The situation for Germany is so bad that it'll take years for the nation to modernize and fully equip its own armor forces at this rate. With the mobilization of its industry, Russia is set to dramatically expand tank production and refurbishment. Meanwhile, the West is basically creating artisanal levels of weapons, with each nut and bolt lovingly handcrafted by master artisans, living high on mountaintop retreats, and even then only when the muses strike them with inspiration. Russia, meanwhile, is pumping out tanks that might be inferior, but in enough numbers to achieve Russia's preferred strategy of victory by means of literally absorbing every bullet and anti-tank missile until you're out of ammo. The nation has an incredible tolerance for pain, taking nearly 100,000 estimated KIA in 2 years of fighting, more than the US suffered in 20 years of fighting in Vietnam. Europe has been slowly waking up to the fact that Russian victory in Ukraine would result in Russia having the largest and most experienced land army in Europe, able to leverage additional Ukrainian manpower, and with an industry and society that's already been fully mobilized for war. Despite 20 months ago Francis Macron stating that Russia must not be humiliated. Today he is singing a different tune and attempting to compel the rest of Europe to wake up and act before it's too late. His fears are well-founded, too, with Ukrainian setbacks across the front with Russia. These setbacks are all the direct result of 2 factors: Europe's inability to properly supply Ukraine and the stalling out of American aid to the nation. Shell shortage directly led to the fall of Avdiivka and further reversals, and today Ukrainian forces are once more having to carefully ration their ammunition. Meanwhile, Russia has imported millions of rounds from abroad and has significantly stepped up domestic production. Europe, on the other hand, failed to meet more than 50% of the million rounds promised in 2023. Though Macron has led the effort in the EU overturning a ban on buying foreign shells, and the EU is now looking to purchase supplies from Europe. The shell legislation that once mandated shells only be procured within the EU is a prime example of the selfish, short-sighted, and irresponsible attitude of the West. While Ukraine is caught in a struggle for its survival and a war that will define the future struggle for Europe, The EU is more interested in continuing to bolster its own economy. Europe has prioritized its own economic well-being for decades, and Putin's charges that Europeans were weak and unable to tolerate pain have proven true. Meanwhile, the United States helped ensure Ukraine's current failures. Sympathizers within the American Congress have continued to hamstring legislation that would provide war-winning levels of military support for Ukraine. Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson has repeatedly refused to put a bill that would provide both funding for Ukraine and for border security to a vote, and the wide consensus even amongst other Republicans increasingly frustrated with MAGA is that he's only doing so to give federal criminal defendant Donald Trump ammunition for his presidential campaign. The Trump campaign wishes to exploit the southern border crisis for political points and is actively working to sabotage any effort that would resolve that crisis. Unfortunately, Ukrainian aid is tied up with a bill that other Republicans have agreed to already, which is why Johnson refuses to put it up for a vote. Trump's comments that he would allow or even encourage Russia to attack NATO members who did not meet 2% funding goals is also more troubling evidence that Johnson's tampering with Ukrainian aid might be about more than just providing fuel for the Trump campaign. The end result is that Putin is now more confident that given a Republican win in 2024, he may be granted the leverage to continue his war past Ukraine, even into NATO itself. Trump has repeatedly stated sentiments to the effect that he would pull the U.S. out of the alliance, and there are few who believe a Trump presidency would be willing to fulfill NATO Article 5 commitments over a Russian attack in the Baltics or Poland. The dark realization that America, the very linchpin of NATO, is no longer a reliable ally, has sent shockwaves around the world. It has undermined U.S. efforts not just in Europe, but in the Pacific, as Pacific partners such as Japan, South Korea, and Australia question the reliability of America in defending against Chinese aggression. This has helped galvanize some in Europe to take the Russian matter more seriously and given Macron reason to think that the time may come when European powers may need to fight Russia inside of Ukraine or risk doing so on their own borders. The Cold War peace dividend is at an end. Now it's up to the West to decide which war to fight, the current one in Ukraine or a future one in the heart of Europe against a much stronger Russia.